The river had always been the kind of place that swallowed things whole and gave nothing back. It ran dark and fast along the eastern edge of Millhaven, cutting through the town like an old scar that never quite healed, its banks slick with mud and river grass, its current heavy with the memory of everything it had taken over the years. Boots, fishing lines, the occasional bicycle a careless child had left too close to the edge. The river took what it wanted and kept it. Everyone in Millhaven knew that. Everyone, that is, except for Callie Marsh. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Callie was 12 years old the first time she found something in the water. Not the iron box that would come later, years later, when she was grown and desperate, and the town had long since stopped believing in anything she said. No, that first time, she found a brass button, tarnished almost black, with a tiny eagle stamped into its face. She had waded in up to her knees, shoes still on, ignoring the cold that bit at her ankles, and she had plucked it right out of the silt like she knew it was there waiting for her. She carried it home in her jacket pocket and kept it on the windowsill above her bed, and she told her grandmother it was a sign that the river still had good things in it, if you were only willing to look. Her grandmother had smiled in the way old women smile when they love you too much to correct you. That was before the eviction notice, before the hospital bills that came in waves like something alive, each one thicker than the last. Before her mother had stopped sleeping and started staring at the kitchen ceiling at 2 in the morning with the lights off, her coffee going cold in her hands. Before Callie herself had come to understand that the river her grandmother had always called their river, the one that ran along the property their family had lived beside for 4 generations, was about to become someone else's river entirely. Callie's mother, Dina Marsh, had raised her alone from the time Callie was 4 years old. The details of her father's departure were not something Dina discussed, not because they were painful, though they were, but because she was a woman who believed in forward motion. You kept your eyes ahead. You worked. You made do. You did not sit at the edge of what was lost and let it pull you under. That was the Marsh way, or at least it had been, back when there was something to stand on. The house they lived in had belonged to Dina's grandmother before it belonged to Dina. It was a small place, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a window that stuck in its frame from October through March, a porch that tilted slightly toward the left as though the whole structure were listening for something in the river below. The land the house sat on was more valuable than the house itself. Everyone knew that, but the Marsh family had never treated it as something to be sold. It was something to be kept, something that kept you, if you were wise enough to understand the difference. The trouble started, as trouble often does, quietly. A letter from the county assessor's office, then another, then a third. The property taxes on the Marsh land had been assessed at a new rate following a regional land survey, and the amount owed had climbed from something manageable to something impossible. Dina worked 2 jobs, mornings at the diner on Route 9 and evenings doing bookkeeping for a small hardware store on the edge of town, and she was still short. Short by thousands. Short by a distance that felt, on the worst nights, like it could not be crossed. Then came the medical bills from Callie's emergency appendectomy in February. $11,000 after insurance, spread across 4 different payment plans that each arrived in their own envelope, each with their own due date, each printed in the same cheerful font as though the numbers themselves did not understand what they were asking. Dina did not tell Callie how bad it was. She told her things were tight. She told her they were working through it. She told her, more than once, that the Marsh family had been through worse and come out the other side. Callie was old enough to hear the spaces between those words, to understand that her mother was carrying something heavy, but young enough to believe that carrying was enough, that love and work and stubbornness could hold a thing together long past the point where it should have fallen apart. What Callie did not know, not then, was that a man named Gerald Fitch had been making offers on the Marsh property for the better part of 2 years. Gerald Fitch ran a development company out of the regional capital and had his eyes on the river frontage. He was not unkind in the way that villains in stories are unkind. He was polite, in fact. He shook hands firmly. He wore clean shirts. He sent letters on good paper. But he wanted what he wanted with the quiet, implacable patience of a man who understood that debt was his most reliable ally, that if he simply waited, the math would do the work for him. Dina had turned down his first offer, and his second, and his third. By the time Callie was 26 years old, there had been 9 offers, and Dina Marsh was gone. She had died on a Tuesday in early November, 3 weeks after her 61st birthday, from a stroke that came without warning and left without apology. She was there in the morning, and by afternoon she was not, and the world continued turning in the blank, in different way it always does, and Callie stood in the kitchen of the house that tilted toward the river and tried to understand how a person was supposed to keep breathing when the ground had simply opened up beneath them. The inheritance, such as it was, came with complications. The back taxes were still owed. Gerald Fitch sent a letter of condolence with his 10th offer folded neatly inside it. Callie's aunt, her mother's older sister, Barbara, who lived 3 counties away and visited twice a year with opinions she had not been asked for, called within the week to advise Callie to take the money and be sensible about it. Be sensible, Barbara said. You can't hold on to something that's bleeding you dry. You're young. You can start fresh somewhere. There's no shame in it. Callie thanked her aunt for calling and hung up the phone and sat for a long time at the kitchen table with the offer letter in her hand. $312,000 for the land and the house together. It was more money than she had ever held a picture of in her mind. It was also, she understood with a certainty she could not explain, the wrong answer. She was not, by the standards of Millhaven, a remarkable young woman. She had a degree in environmental studies from a community college 2 towns over, which she had earned by taking night classes while working the same diner her mother had worked. She had a part-time job at the County Water Authority doing water quality sampling along the river corridor, which meant, most mornings, she was already at the river's edge with rubber boots and collection jars before the rest of the town had finished its first cup of coffee. She had no savings worth speaking of, a 12-year-old car with a heating system that worked only when it felt like it, and a reputation in town for being the girl who argued with the county planning board at public meetings, which was the kind of thing that made people in Millhaven sigh and say, bless her heart, she's just like her mother. She was. She knew it. She wore it like a coat. What she also had, though she would not have described it this way, was a kind of attention, a quality of looking that most people lose somewhere between childhood and adulthood, the ability to see a thing for what it actually is rather than for what it is supposed to be. It was the quality that had made her good at her water sampling work, the ability to notice when something was slightly off, when the color was a shade wrong, or the smell carried a note it should not have carried. Her supervisor had told her once that she had better instincts for the river than anyone he had ever trained. She had been pleased by that in a way she could not entirely articulate, because the river felt, to her, like something she already knew, something she had always known, which was why, 3 weeks after her mother's funeral, on a cold morning in late November when the river was running high and brown with recent rain, Callie was wading along its southern bank with her collection jars, and her clipboard, and her rubber boots, and she saw the iron box. It was not where it should have been. That was the first thing she noticed, because nothing about it made sense in the landscape. The bank at that particular bend was composed of river silt and old clay and the occasional exposed root system of the willows that grew along the edge of the Marsh property. It was not the kind of place where iron boxes sat. Iron boxes sat in attics. They sat in basements. They sat in the backs of estate sale tables under hand-lettered signs that said "Make an offer." They did not sit wedged between 2 exposed willow roots at the waterline of a river in November, their surfaces thick with rust the color of dried blood, their edges half buried in mud, as though they had been there long enough to become part of the bank itself. Callie stood very still for a moment. The river moved around her boots. The wind came off the water with its teeth in it, the kind of cold that makes your eyes water without your permission. She looked at the box for a long time before she moved toward it, the way her grandmother had taught her to approach a thing in the wild that you were not sure of, slowly, without sudden movements, giving it time to understand your intentions. It was locked. Of course it was locked. The lock was a heavy iron mechanism, old, the keyhole filled with rust and river mud. But when she tugged at the hasp, it did not give at all. Whatever was inside had been sealed here with intention. Not lost, not forgotten, hidden, or waiting. She was not yet sure which. She tried to lift it and found it heavier than it looked. Much heavier, the kind of weight that suggested dense contents rather than bulk. She got it up out of the mud with both hands, arms straining, and waded with it to the bank, where she set it down on higher ground and stood over it, catching her breath. It was roughly the size of a shoebox, but the iron was thick, old-fashioned thick, the kind of workmanship that did not count the weight against itself. There were markings on the lid letters, she thought at first, but when she crouched closer, she saw they were initials, pressed into the iron in a style that looked old enough to have been made with a stamp rather than a machine. E. H. M. Below the initials, almost invisible beneath the rust, 3 numbers, 1927. 1927. Callie sat back on her heels in the mud and looked at the box and felt something she did not entirely have a name for. It was not excitement exactly, though excitement was part of it. It was more like the feeling of standing at the edge of a room and knowing, before you step in, that something in there is going to matter. She carried the box to her car. She called her supervisor and told him she had found a potential historical artifact in the river corridor and needed to document its location before she removed it. He told her to photograph it in situ first, which she had already done, and to fill out the relevant form, which she would. Then she put the box in her trunk and drove home. She did not tell anyone else. Not right away. She would come to understand, later, that this was the wisest decision she made in those first days. The silence, the not telling. Because Millhaven was a town that had opinions about Callie Marsh before she opened her mouth, and what those opinions did not include was the possibility that she might be right about something important. She set the box on the kitchen table, the same table where her mother had sat with cold coffee and sleepless eyes, and she looked at it while the kettle boiled. The rust was surface rust. She could see that now in the better light, the kind that forms on iron that has been exposed to water and air for decades, but has not compromised the structural integrity underneath. The lock mechanism was old, but intact. The seam around the lid was tight, which meant the interior had likely remained relatively dry, protected by the density of the iron and the angle at which it had been lodged in the bank. Whatever was inside had been preserved. She spent 2 evenings researching lock mechanisms of that era before she found a local ironworker named Pete Grasso who agreed, for $50 and no questions, to cut the hasp without damaging the box itself. He did it in his workshop on a Thursday afternoon, the grinder sending sparks across the concrete floor, and when the lock fell away, he stepped back and let Callie open it herself. She lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilskin that had yellowed but not disintegrated, was a document. Several documents, in fact folded, pressed flat by the weight of the iron above them. The edges brown with age, but the paper itself intact, the ink still legible in the way that quality ink on quality paper can remain legible for nearly a century if it has been kept dry and sealed from light. Pete Grasso looked at the documents, then at Callie, then back at the documents. "What is all that?" he asked. Callie carefully unfolded the top sheet with hands that, she noticed distantly, were not entirely steady. It was a deed, a property deed. The language was old, formal in the way legal language from the early 20th century always was, full of whereas and heretofores, and shall be bound in perpetuity. It took her 3 readings to understand what she was looking at. Then she read it a 4th time to make sure she had understood correctly. The deed conveyed title to a piece of land, a specific piece of land, described with the surveyor's precision of the era, bounded on the north by such and such a line, on the east by the river corridor, on the south by the old county road that had since been renamed but was clearly identifiable to a person named Elara Harriet Marsh. Marsh. Not a coincidence. There were no coincidences like that. Callie's hands were shaking now. She set the deed carefully on Pete Grasso's workbench and picked up the next document in the stack. This one was not a deed. It was a letter, handwritten, in a script so precise it looked almost printed. The date at the top read March 14th, 1927. The salutation read, "To whoever holds this box in the time when it is needed." She read the letter standing up, in Pete Grasso's workshop, with the smell of iron filings in the air and the sound of traffic on the road outside, and by the time she reached the end of it, she was not shaking anymore. She was something past shaking. She was very, very still, because the letter was not just a letter. It was an explanation. And what it explained was this. Elara Harriet Marsh, Callie's great-great-grandmother, had been the rightful heir to a piece of land and an estate that had been taken from her through fraudulent means in the years following her husband's death. The land had been stripped from her through a combination of forged documents and the particular kind of institutional indifference that, in the 1920s, was routinely applied to women who did not have men to speak for them in legal proceedings. Elara had contested it. She had fought. She had lost. But she had not given up. What she had done instead was this. She had gathered every document she possessed that proved her claim the original deed to the property, correspondence with the attorneys who had represented her, a sworn statement from a witness to the original land survey, a bank record showing the purchase price paid in 1902, and one additional document that Callie had not yet fully read, but which the letter described as the most important of all. She had placed these documents in the iron box. She had locked it, and she had put it in the river, wedged into the bank of the property that had been taken from her, because she understood something that the men who had stolen from her did not, that the river was hers, in a way that no court document could revoke, and that the river would keep what she gave it until the right person came to take it back. She had been waiting for 89 years. No, the box had been waiting. Elara herself had died in 1954 in a rented room on the north side of Millhaven, without ever seeing her land returned. But she had believed. She had believed so completely in the rightness of her claim that she had sealed the evidence and trusted the river to hold it, trusted that someday, someone with Marsh blood and the willingness to look would find it. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Callie stood in Pete Grasso's workshop for a long time after she finished reading. Pete himself had retreated to the far end of the space with the particular tact of a man who has learned, through decades of dealing with people, when to make himself scarce. The evening light came, through the high windows in long golden bars. The box sat on the workbench with its lid open, the oilskin wrapping spread out around the documents like hands letting go of something they had been holding for a very long time. She picked up the last document in the stack. The one Elara's letter had called the most important of all. It was not a deed. It was not a letter. It was a trust instrument, a legal document, drawn up by an attorney named Samuel Coates in the year 1924, establishing a trust in the name of Elara Harriet Marsh and her descendants, funded by the proceeds of a life insurance policy and a set of investment bonds purchased in her name by her late husband, Thomas Marsh, in the years before his death. The trust had been established quietly, separately from the property dispute, as a kind of hedge against the outcome Elara feared. The attorneys who had failed her in the land case had not known about it. The men who had stripped her of the property had not known about it. It had sat, like the box itself, in a place where those who did not know how to look for it would never find it. The value of the trust as established in 1924 was listed at the bottom of the document in the clean, unsentimental language of financial instruments. Callie read the number. She read it again. She turned the document over, as though there might be something on the back that would change what the front said. There was nothing on the back. She looked at the number a third time. It was not the 1924 value that mattered, of course. It was what that value had become over the course of 89 years of compounded interest on bonds and investment instruments that had never been touched, never been drawn from, never been claimed because no one had known to claim them. The trust had continued to grow in the quiet, patient way that money grows when no one is spending it, accumulating in accounts that had been transferred and retransferred through the mechanisms of estate law without ever being dissolved. Because Elara's attorney had built into the instrument a provision that required a direct descendant bearing the Marsh name to come forward in person with the original trust document to claim the funds. The original trust document, which had been in the iron box. In the river, Callie called her supervisor from Pete Grasso's driveway and told him she needed to take personal leave, effective immediately. She called her Aunt Barbara and said there was something she needed to talk to her about. She drove home with the iron box in the passenger seat beside her, belted in like a person, and she sat in the driveway of the house that was still, technically, being threatened with seizure for back taxes, and she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what the day had held. Then she went inside, made coffee, and started making a list. The list was practical. That was the Marsh way, and Callie was very much a Marsh. She wrote down the names of attorneys she would need to consult. She wrote down the steps for authenticating historical documents. She wrote down the phone number for the county records office, where she would need to request the original land survey from 1902, and the number for the State Historical Society, where records of the trust instrument might be corroborated, and the number for the financial institution, a regional bank that had been absorbed into a larger national bank in the 1980s, but whose records, she had reason to believe, had been retained. She wrote down the name Gerald Fitch and drew a box around it. Then she sat back and looked at her list and understood, with a clarity that felt physical, like pressure behind her sternum, that she was about to do something that Millhaven would not believe, and that this was fine, because she had spent her entire life being something Millhaven did not believe. The next morning, she called the office of an attorney named Miriam Cho, who specialized in estate law and historical property claims and had a reputation, in legal circles, for the particular pleasure she took in cases where the historical record had been deliberately obscured. Callie left a message describing, briefly, what she had found. Miriam Cho called back within the hour. She drove to the attorney's office 2 towns over with the iron box and its contents secured in a padded bag she'd borrowed from her water sampling kit. She sat across from Miriam Cho, who was a small woman with a precise manner and eyes that missed nothing, and she laid the documents out on the conference table one by one. Miriam Cho examined each one in silence. She put on reading glasses. She removed them. She put them on again. She made small sounds, not quite words, while she read the trust instrument, the sounds of a person encountering something that is better than they expected. When she had finished, she looked up at Callie. "Where did you find this?" she asked. "In the river," Callie said. There was a pause. "Of course you did," Miriam Cho said, and something in her expression suggested she had heard stranger things, or perhaps that she had not, but was prepared to believe it anyway. "Here is what we are dealing with," she said. She set the trust instrument flat on the table and placed her fingertip on the founding value listed at the bottom. This trust was established in 1924 and has been continuously accruing since that time. Based on the bond instruments listed here and the investment structure your great-great-grandmother's husband selected, the compounded value as of today would be. She paused and looked at Callie steadily significant. "I am not going to give you a specific number until I have spoken with the financial institution and confirmed the current status of the accounts. But I will tell you that the word significant, in this context, is not an understatement." Callie nodded. She had done the math herself, roughly, the night before, and she had arrived at a number that she had dismissed as impossible and then recalculated and then dismissed again. She was curious to know if Miriam Cho's impossible number was the same as hers. "I also want to be direct with you," Miriam said. "This is going to be a process. Historical claims of this nature require authentication of documents, corroboration of the chain of custody, verification of your lineage as a direct descendant." She tapped the deed, which bears your family name, and which we will need to connect to your birth record through a continuous documentary chain. It is not going to happen this week or next week. It may take months. Callie said she understood. "I also want to warn you," Miriam continued, "that when word of this gets out, and it will get out, these things always get out, you are going to encounter people who will tell you this is not real, that you have misread the documents, that a box in a river cannot possibly hold what you say it holds. Some of those people will say it out of ignorance. Some will say it because they have interests that are not served by your success." She looked at Callie over the top of her reading glasses. "I want to know that you are prepared for that." Callie thought about her mother, staring at the kitchen ceiling at 2 in the morning. She thought about Elara Marsh, dying in a rented room in 1954, having never seen her land returned. She thought about the river, dark and cold and patient, holding the box in its roots for 89 years. "I've been not believed my whole life," she said. "I know what it costs. I can pay it." Miriam Cho looked at her for a moment, and then she smiled, not the polite smile of a professional managing a client's expectations, but the real smile of a woman who recognizes something in another woman that she respects. "Good," she said. "Then let's get to work." The weeks that followed were not quiet. The authentication process required the documents to be examined by 2 independent specialists in historical paper and ink analysis, both of whom confirmed that the materials were consistent with the time period indicated. The county records office, after considerable prodding from Miriam's office, produced the original 1902 land survey that corroborated the deed's property description down to the inch. The State Historical Society confirmed a record of the trust establishment in their archive of notarized legal instruments from the 1920s, a discovery that made the archivist there, a man named David Rowe, call Miriam's office personally to express what he described, with academic restraint, as considerable interest. The financial institution, or rather, The large national bank that had absorbed the regional bank that had absorbed the smaller bank where Samuel Coates had originally placed the trust funds in 1924 was a different kind of conversation. It required lawyers and records requests and a period of institutional resistance that Miriam navigated with the focused patience of a woman who had done this before and expected it. Banks, she explained to Callie, do not enjoy discovering that they have been sitting on unclaimed assets for nearly a century. The discovery requires them to both acknowledge the funds and explain why no one had found them before, which is not a narrative any institution finds comfortable. But the records were there. They were unambiguous. The trust had been maintained through every institutional transfer, flagged as dormant, but preserved under the terms of the founding instrument, which required the funds to be held in perpetuity until claimed. The balance had been growing, slowly and steadily, through every decade of neglect. Miriam called Callie on a Thursday morning in February. She told her to come into the office. She told her to sit down. Then she told her the number. The compounded value of Elara Marsh's trust, as of that Thursday in February, was $385 million. $385 million. Callie sat in the chair across from Miriam Cho's desk and looked at the window and did not say anything for a very long time. Outside, it was snowing the thin, indifferent February kind that Millhaven always got, the kind that stuck to the roads and made the drive home longer than it should be. She watched a single flake hit the glass and dissolve. She thought about her mother, working mornings at the diner and evenings at the hardware store and never once complaining, never once letting Callie see the full weight of what she was carrying. She thought about her grandmother, smiling in the way old women smile when they love you too much to correct you. She thought about Elara, kneeling at the river's edge in 1927 with an iron box in her arms, trusting the water to hold what the courts had refused to protect. She thought about the river, dark and cold and patient. Then she looked at Miriam Cho and said, "What do we do next?" What they did next was methodical and thorough, because that was the only way to do a thing like this. There was paperwork. There was documentation. There was a formal process for establishing Callie's status as the qualifying descendant birth certificates and death certificates and census records going back 4 generations, each one adding a link to the chain that connected Callie Marsh, 26 years old, water quality sampler, resident of a house with a porch that tilted toward the river, to Elara Marsh, who had knelt at that same river's edge and believed that the right person would come. The genealogical documentation took 6 weeks. The bank's verification process took another 4. Miriam filed the formal claim in early March, and the institutional machinery began its slow, grinding turn toward resolution. During this time, Callie told almost no one. She told her Aunt Barbara, who was silent for so long on the phone that Callie thought the call had dropped. She told Pete Grasso, who said congratulations and then, after a pause, said he hoped she remembered who had cut the hasp, which made her laugh. She told her supervisor at the Water Authority, who told her to take as much leave as she needed and that her job would be there when she came back, which was the kindest thing anyone said to her in those months. She did not tell anyone else. Not yet. Because Miriam had been right. Word was going to get out, and when it did, the thing she had been carrying quietly and carefully was going to become public in ways she could not fully control. She wanted the claim to be solid, irrefutable, documented beyond any reasonable challenge, before she handed it to the world to have opinions about. The world, when it found out, had many opinions. It started with a local journalist, a young woman who wrote for the regional paper and had a nose for the kind of story that other people dismissed as too strange to be true. She had heard something from someone who had heard something from someone else, the chain of gossip that always forms around things people are not supposed to know yet. She called Miriam's office. Miriam said no comment. She called the bank. The bank said no comment. She called the county records office, and the archivist there, David Rowe from the State Historical Society, was less disciplined about no comment than either of the others. The story ran on a Wednesday. Woman finds locked iron box in river, claims $385 million inheritance deed inside. Callie read it at the kitchen table. She read it 3 times. Then she put down her coffee and sat for a while in the quiet of her mother's kitchen, listening to the sound of the river through the window. She had opened 2 inches despite the cold, because she liked to hear it. The reaction in Millhaven was swift and broadly in the direction of disbelief. "She made it up," said a man at the gas station on Route 9. "Documents like that don't survive in a river for 100 years, said the woman who ran the pharmacy. "Even if the box existed, which I doubt, the trust claim won't hold up. Those things lapse," said a man at the town council meeting where someone brought it up despite it having nothing to do with the agenda. Her Aunt Barbara called and said she had been thinking, and perhaps Callie should not get her hopes up, and had she considered that perhaps the documents were forgeries of some kind. Gerald Fitch did not call. Gerald Fitch sent a letter through his own attorney, noting that the property in question remained subject to its outstanding tax obligations regardless of any claimed inheritance proceeding, and that he remained available to discuss a purchase agreement at the previously offered price should Ms. Marsh find her circumstances requiring a prompt resolution. Callie filed the letter in a folder she labeled "Things That No Longer Apply" and went back to working through the documentation with Miriam. What no one in Millhaven knew, what Callie herself was only beginning to fully absorb, was that the trust instrument contained provisions beyond the monetary claim. Elara Marsh, guided by Samuel Coates in 1924, had been thorough. The trust did not simply preserve money. It preserved the land claim as well, in a separate legal instrument attached to the trust as an exhibit, establishing that a successful claim on the trust funds would trigger an automatic review of the fraudulent property transfer of 1923 under the estate laws that had been in place at the time, laws that Miriam had explained with the particular satisfaction of someone delivering very good news, had been structured to protect precisely this kind of posthumous challenge. Elara had not simply hidden the money. She had built a legal mechanism that would, if the trust was ever successfully claimed, force the courts to look again at what had been done to her. She had understood, in 1924, that the fraud might not be correctable in her own lifetime. She had built something designed to outlast her. Something designed for the person who would come after, who would find the box, who would carry the name. She had built it for Callie. Callie sat with that understanding for a long time on a cold evening in March, in the kitchen of the house with the tilting porch, with the river running below her in the dark and the iron box sitting on the counter where she could see it. She thought about the kind of faith it required to do something like that, to build a thing you would never see used, for a person whose face you could not know, across a distance of time that would swallow everything you recognized and leave only the structure itself standing. She thought it was the bravest thing she had ever heard of. She got up and washed her coffee cup and turned off the kitchen light and went to bed, and for the first time since her mother died, she slept the whole night through. The thing about being disbelieved is that it has a texture. It is not simply the absence of belief, it is something more active than that, more present, something you can feel against your skin when you walk into a room where people have already made up their minds about you. Callie had grown up with that texture. She knew it the way you know the feel of a familiar piece of clothing, the way it sits on your shoulders, the way it follows you through a day. What she was not prepared for was how much louder it would get once there was something specific to disbelieve. Before the newspaper story ran, she had been, to most of Millhaven, simply Callie Marsh, the girl from the river house, the one who argued at planning board meetings, the one whose mother had worked herself quiet for 20 years and died before she got to stop. People had a shape for her in their minds, and it was a modest shape, something they understood and did not feel threatened by. She was fine. She was local. She was not going anywhere remarkable. The story changed the shape. Now she was something else, something that required a response, an opinion, a position, and the position that Millhaven arrived at, almost collectively, with the speed and confidence of a town that had never been wrong about anything it had decided to be right about, was that Callie Marsh was mistaken, or confused, or, in the more generous versions of the story that circulated through the diner on Route 9 and the hardware store and the parking lot of the grocery store on Elm, simply unfortunate, a grieving young woman who had found some old papers in a box and convinced herself they meant something they did not. No one said she was lying. That was the particular mercy of small-town skepticism. They did not call her a liar. They called her deluded. They called her hopeful in the way that hopeful can be made to sound like a diagnosis. Her Aunt Barbara drove up from 3 counties away to have what she described as a serious conversation. She sat at the kitchen table with the iron box in front of her. Callie had left it there because it was hers, and she was not going to put it away to spare anyone's discomfort, and she said the things she had been organizing on the drive up, the reasonable things, the practical things, the things she believed she was saying out of love. "Callie," she said, "I know how much you want this to be real. I know how hard things have been. But honey, you need to think about what you're doing. Attorneys cost money. This process costs money. And if it doesn't pan out, you're going to be worse off than you were before, and the taxes are still going to be due, and that man Fitch is still going to be making his offer, and at least that offer is real. It is guaranteed. It is something you can put in your hand right now." Callie poured her aunt a cup of coffee and set it in front of her and sat down and said, "Miriam Cho is working on contingency. I'm not paying her until the claim resolves. The documents have been authenticated by 2 independent specialists. The trust record has been confirmed by the State Historical Society. The bank has acknowledged the existence of the accounts. This is not something I want to be real. It is real." Barbara wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at Callie with the expression of a woman who was not going to be moved, but was trying to find a gentler way to say so. "Even if it is," she said, "these things take years. Courts, appeals, challenges. You could be 80 years old before you see a dollar of it. And in the meantime, what are you living on?" Callie looked at her aunt for a moment. Then she looked at the iron box. Then she looked back at her aunt. "What was Elara living on?" she asked. Barbara did not have an answer for that. The weeks that followed had their own rhythm. Not the rhythm of resolution, but the rhythm of process, the slow, paper-intensive, bureaucratically demanding rhythm of a legal claim making its way through the institutions designed to test it. Miriam filed motions. The bank's attorneys responded. Miriam filed responses to the responses. The County Historical Records Office fulfilled 3 separate document requests, each one requiring a written submission and a waiting period that seemed calibrated to discourage all but the most committed. David Rowe at the State Historical Society became, without meaning to, one of the most important people in Callie's life during those months, because he was thorough and he was honest, and he called her twice a week with updates on the archival corroboration that his office was assembling, and he never once said anything that suggested he found the claim unreasonable. What he said, once, was this: "Your great-great-grandmother was a very careful woman. She understood that the people who would challenge this claim would expect the documents to be incomplete, and she made sure they were not." Callie thanked him and hung up and stood in her kitchen for a while, thinking about Elara being careful, thinking about what it cost to be careful when everything was falling apart around you, thinking about her mother, who had also been careful, who had balanced the household accounts to the dollar and never once let Callie see the numbers, who had been careful in a way that was its own kind of strength even when the strength was not enough. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Gerald Fitch sent a second letter in April. This one was less polite than the first. His attorney's language was precise in the way that legal language can be precise while still conveying threat, noting that the property's outstanding tax obligations would enter a formal delinquency process in 60 days, that the county assessor's office had confirmed this timeline, and that while Mr. Fitch remained open to a negotiated resolution, the window for such a resolution was not unlimited. There was a phrase near the bottom of the letter that Callie read twice. Mr. Fitch wishes to emphasize that the pendency of any separate legal proceeding does not affect the county's statutory authority to proceed with tax enforcement regardless of the outcome of such proceedings. She brought the letter to Miriam, who read it and set it down with the calm of a woman who had read many such letters. "He's right," Miriam said, which is the annoying thing about Gerald Fitch. The tax process and the inheritance claim are legally independent. The county can move forward on the taxes whether or not the trust claim succeeds. She paused. However, she slid a document across the desk. "I filed this yesterday. It was a motion for a temporary injunction on the tax enforcement process, on the grounds that the property in question was the subject of an active historical property claim and that enforcement during the pendency of that claim would cause irreparable harm to the claimant's ability to preserve the claim's subject matter." Miriam looked at Callie steadily. "It's a long shot," she said. "Judges don't love intervening in tax enforcement. But the historical property angle gives us an argument that is not entirely without merit, and I know the judge assigned to the motion, and she is not someone who enjoys being on the wrong side of history, literally or figuratively." The motion was filed on a Tuesday. By Thursday, the story had made it into the regional newspaper, which was read by a journalist at a larger paper who called Miriam's office and was told no comment, and then called the county clerk's office and was told less than no comment, and then called Pete Grasso, who told her the whole story from the beginning, including the part about cutting the hasp with a grinder in his workshop and the sparks on the concrete floor. The second story ran the following Monday. It was longer than the first, more detailed, and it included a photograph of the iron box that Pete Grasso had taken on his phone and provided without quite realizing he was providing it. The headline read, "Millhaven Woman's River Discovery Sparks $385 million estate battle, but her town isn't convinced." The story was balanced in the way journalism sometimes tries to be balanced, which meant it gave equal weight to the documented facts of the claim and to the opinions of people who had not read the documents and were not attorneys and had no particular expertise in historical estate law. It quoted a man named Ron Bellamy, who ran the bait shop on the south end of town, as saying that he had known Dina Marsh, and she was a good woman, but her daughter had always been the type to see things that weren't there. It quoted a county official who noted, carefully, that the tax process would proceed according to statute regardless of any other proceedings. It quoted Miriam Cho saying no comment. It quoted Callie saying nothing, because Callie had not returned the journalist's call. She read the story at the kitchen table and then set down her phone and looked out the window at the river. It was early May by then. The willows along the bank were fully leaved, their branches trailing in the current, and the water had dropped back to its spring level, running clear and fast over the stones near the bend. She could see, from where she sat, the approximate location of the willow roots where the box had been. The roots were submerged now, invisible under the moving water. She thought about Elara standing at that spot in 1927 with the box in her arms, and she thought about the river taking it, and she thought about what it felt like to trust something that completely, to give the most important thing you had to a force that was indifferent to your need, and hope it would still be there when someone came looking. She thought it must have felt something like this, like standing very still while the world made noise around you, and trusting that the thing you knew was true would eventually be provable. She got up and made more coffee and went back to work. The motion for a temporary injunction was heard on a Thursday in May before Judge Patricia Adwell, a woman in her late 50s whose reputation was, as Miriam had suggested, for taking the long view. Callie sat in the courtroom and watched Miriam argue the case with the focused precision of someone who had prepared for every counterargument and was not going to be surprised by any of them. The county's attorney argued that the tax process was statutory and not subject to discretionary interference. Gerald Fitch's attorney, who had inserted himself into the proceedings as an interested third party, argued that the inheritance claim was speculative and unproven, and that granting the injunction would set a problematic precedent for tax enforcement generally. Miriam's response to the second argument was the best thing Callie heard in a courtroom for a long time. She said, "Counsel characterizes the inheritance claim as speculative. The documents have been authenticated by two independent specialists with a combined 70 years of experience in historical document analysis. The trust record has been confirmed in the State Historical Society's archive. The bank has confirmed the existence of the accounts in writing. What counsel means, when he says speculative, is that he finds it inconvenient. Those are not the same thing." Judge Adwell looked at Gerald Fitch's attorney for a moment over the top of her reading glasses. Then she looked at Miriam. Then she looked down at the papers in front of her. She did not say anything for long enough that the silence became a kind of statement. She granted the injunction. The tax enforcement process was stayed pending resolution of the inheritance claim. The property could not be seized, auctioned, or transferred during the pendency of the proceedings. Gerald Fitch's window, such as it was closed not permanently, not without conditions, but closed enough that the air in the room changed when the gavel came down. Callie walked out of the courthouse into the May sunshine and stood on the steps and breathed in the way you breathe when something has been pressing on your chest for months and has, for the moment, lifted. Miriam came out behind her, already checking her phone. "That was step one," she said. She looked up at Callie and allowed herself a small, precise smile. It was a good step. It was a good step, but it was not, as Miriam had indicated and Callie well understood, the last step. The injunction bought time. What it did not do was resolve the inheritance claim itself, which was still making its way through the institutional machinery with the patience of something that had waited 89 years and could wait a little longer. The bank had formally acknowledged the existence of the trust accounts in a letter that was, Miriam explained, a significant development not because it confirmed the value of the claim, which they had not yet done, but because it confirmed that the accounts had existed continuously, and had not been liquidated or disposed of. This was important because one of the bank's early arguments had been that records from the 1920s could not be expected to survive intact through multiple institutional transfers, an argument that collapsed when David Rowe produced the corroborating archival record from the State Historical Society, which had been maintained independently of the bank. But the bank had also filed a formal response to Miriam's claim that was 47 pages long and contained, according to Miriam, every possible argument for delay that their attorneys had been able to generate, including several that she described as creative in a tone of voice that suggested she did not mean it as a compliment. There is a particular kind of institutional resistance, Miriam told Callie over coffee in her office one afternoon, that is not about the merits of the claim. It's about the size of it. If this were a $50,000 trust, they would have resolved it in a month. At $385 million, every attorney in that building has an opinion, every department wants to review it, every executive wants to make sure that when it resolves, the resolution was not their idea. She set down her cup. It's going to take longer than it should. That is not a reflection of the claim's validity. It is a reflection of institutional self-protection. Callie understood. She had worked for an institution, in a small way, at the Water Authority, and she recognized the pattern Miriam was describing, the way large organizations move slowly, not because they cannot move faster, but because speed requires someone to take responsibility, and responsibility is the thing that institutions distribute as widely as possible so that no single person has to bear it. She went back to her water sampling work during those months, because she needed the income and because the work steadied her. She was on the river most mornings before the rest of the town was fully awake, wading in her rubber boots along the banks with her collection jars, taking samples at the designated points, logging temperatures and turbidity readings in her notebook with the care and precision that her supervisor had always praised. She found herself, some mornings, pausing at the bend near the old willow roots, looking down into the water. She did not know what she was looking for. Or maybe she did. Maybe she was looking for whatever it was that Elara had seen in the river, the quality in it that had made her trust it with the most important thing she had. Whatever that quality was, Callie could not name it exactly, but she felt it on those mornings, standing in the current with the water moving around her boots, the way the river was always going somewhere and never seemed to need to explain where. It was on one of those mornings, in late June, that she found the second box. She would not have found it if she had not been looking at the water the way she had been looking at it for months, with the particular quality of attention that her great-great-grandmother had apparently also possessed, the attention that sees a thing for what it is rather than for what it is supposed to be. The second box was smaller than the first, not iron but a dense hardwood, black with age and river moisture, wedged under the bank at a point about 30 feet downstream from where the first box had been. It was barely visible, a dark shape in darker water, the kind of thing you would not see unless you were already looking for things that did not belong. She retrieved it with the same careful, two-handed approach she had used the first time. It was heavier than its size suggested, like the first one. The lid was not locked this time, but it was swollen shut with moisture and age, and it took her 10 minutes of patient work with a flat tool from her sampling kit to open it without damaging the contents. Inside, wrapped in the same oilskin as the documents in the iron box, was a photograph and a letter. The photograph was very old, sepia-toned, printed on the thick cardstock of the early 20th century. It showed a woman standing in front of a house. The woman was tall and straight, with the kind of posture that speaks of a person who has decided, consciously and permanently, not to be diminished. She was looking directly at the camera with an expression that was not quite a smile. It was something more like resolve, the expression of a person who has made peace with the long game. The house behind her was the house Callie was living in. There was no question about it. The porch was straight in the photograph, not yet settled into its familiar tilt, but the roofline, the chimney, the proportions of the windows, it was the same house, seen from the same angle, 100 years earlier. Written on the back of the photograph, in the same precise script as the letter in the iron box, Elara H. Marsh, 1924. For the one who comes after. The letter was shorter than the first one. It said, I have told you everything I know in the other letter. This one is only to tell you what I believe, which is different from what I know. I believe that the land remembers who it belongs to. I believe that a thing taken by fraud is never truly owned by the one who took it. I believe that the river knows the difference between what is lost and what is waiting. I placed the first box in the roots because I knew the roots would hold it. I have watched those roots hold things for 30 years, and I know what they can keep. I am placing this one here, a little further down, so that if the first is ever found, this one might confirm it. So that you will know you are not alone in it. So that you will know she was here, and she believed, and she left you everything she could. I am sorry it took this long. I am sorry you had to wait. I am glad you were stubborn enough to have found it. All my love. Across whatever distance. Elara. Callie sat on the bank of the river in her rubber boots with the photograph in one hand and the letter in the other, and the water moving past her feet, and she allowed herself to cry for the first time since her mother's funeral. Not because she was sad, she was not. Exactly, not in that moment. She cried because of the distance in the letter, the vast, patient, across whatever distance quality of it, the love in it that had survived everything that had tried to erase it. She cried because Elara had been right that it took this long. And she cried because Elara had also been right that she was stubborn enough. And she cried because some things are just worth crying over, not because they are lost, but because they are found. She sat there until she was finished. Then she dried her face with her sleeve, put the photograph and letter carefully back in the wooden box, and went home. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She brought the second box to Miriam, who brought it to the same two document specialists who had authenticated the first set. They confirmed the material's consistency with the period. David Rowe, when she told him about the photograph, was quiet for a long moment and then said that he would very much like to see it, which was the most emotional she had ever heard him get. The second letter, Miriam noted, was not a legal document. It would not change the mechanics of the claim, but it would matter in other ways, in the ways that things matter when you are trying to show a judge or a bank or a skeptical world that a story is real, that it has texture and depth and human specificity that forgeries rarely achieve. A forger might replicate a deed. A forger might replicate a trust instrument. A forger would not write, because it is not the kind of thing a forger thinks to write, that the river knows the difference between what is lost and what is waiting. Callie brought the photograph to the local historical society, a small institution run by a woman named Frances Beale, who had gray hair and a manner of absolute precision about dates and provenance and the chain of custody of objects. Frances Beale looked at the photograph for a long time. She looked at the house in the background. She looked at the woman's posture, the set of her jaw, the expression that was not quite a smile. She looked at the writing on the back. Then she looked up at Callie with an expression Callie had not seen on anyone's face in Millhaven in a very long time. Recognition. I've seen this woman before, Frances said. Not the photograph. She came forward, I understand, during the property case in the 20s. There's a record of her testimony in the county court transcript. The county commission denied her claim, but the transcript was preserved. Can I see it? Callie asked. Frances Beale went into the back room and returned with a bound volume of photocopied documents from the county court records of the 1920s. She turned to a specific page with the certainty of someone who knew exactly where things were in her own archive. There, in faded type, was the record of a hearing dated November 1923 in the matter of the Marsh property. And in the margin of the page, in handwriting that Callie now recognized, that same precise, almost printed script was a single word, written in pencil, barely visible after 100 years. Yet. Callie stared at it. Yet. Not a sentence. Not an argument. Just one word, written in the margin of the document that had failed her, with the calm and the certainty of a person who understood that this was not the end. Callie pressed her fingers flat against the page, not touching the pencil mark, but feeling the paper around it, the way you feel around the edge of something precious. She bought herself coffee on the way back to the car. She sat in the parking lot of the Historical Society and called Miriam. We have a witness record, she said. Elara testified. There's a county court transcript. Miriam was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that is very useful. That is corroboration of the property claim independent of the documents in the box. She paused. Send me the citation. I'll have David Rowe's office pull the full transcript. The full transcript arrived 3 days later. It was 14 pages of testimony from Elara Harriet Marsh, delivered in November of 1923, describing in precise detail the history of the property, the purchase made by her husband in 1902, the correspondence with attorneys following his death, the specific documents that had been forged in the subsequent transfer. The Commission had denied her claim on procedural grounds, not on the merits, the Commission had noted, but because the evidentiary standard for overturning a recorded transfer was not met. The documents Elara had presented had been deemed insufficient. The documents she had subsequently placed in the iron box, the originals rather than the copies she had presented at the hearing, were exactly the documents the Commission had said were missing. She had known what they needed. She had it. She had not been able to produce it in time, so she had preserved it. For someone who knew how to read it, the transcript was not a record of defeat. It was a map. It showed exactly what had been required and exactly what Elara had preserved in response. It was the final piece of the authentication, not of the documents themselves, which had already been authenticated, but of the intention behind them, the deliberate, specific, painstaking intention of a woman who was building a case that would outlast her. Miriam filed a supplemental brief incorporating the transcript within the week. The bank's attorneys, who had been running their 47-page delay strategy with considerable institutional confidence, filed a response that was, Miriam noted with satisfaction, 14 pages shorter than their initial filing. The reduction in page count was not accidental. It reflected the fact that several of their arguments had been undercut by the transcript's existence. Gerald Fitch sent no letter in June. Callie noticed the absence. She did not find it reassuring. He sent one in July. This one was not from his attorney. It was from him directly, handwritten on his personal stationery, and it was different in tone from everything that had come before. It was almost, she thought, reading it at the kitchen table with the window open and the river sounds coming in, apologetic. He wrote that he was aware that the legal situation had developed in ways that were perhaps not fully anticipated, and that he wanted her to know that his interest in the property had always been a business interest rather than a personal one, and that he wished her well regardless of how the proceedings resolved. It was the first time, in all the months of letters and motions and counterfilings, that Gerald Fitch had wished her anything. She read the letter twice, trying to understand what it meant. Then she understood. It meant that someone, either his attorney or someone with access to the bank's internal communications, had told him something about the direction of the proceedings that had shifted his calculation. Gerald Fitch was not a man who wished people well, unless wishing them well cost him nothing. She called Miriam. Has something happened? She asked. There's been a development, Miriam said. Her voice had the quality of someone containing something. I was going to call you this afternoon. The bank has requested a meeting. A meeting, Callie said. Not their attorneys. Their senior trust administration team. They want to meet with us directly, without the legal filings as the primary mode of communication. Callie sat down. What does that mean? She asked. It means, Miriam said carefully, that someone inside the bank has made a decision. It means that the 47 pages of delay strategy has been overruled by someone senior enough to overrule it, which suggests that the internal analysis has concluded something that the delay strategy was designed to avoid concluding. She paused. I think they're going to acknowledge the claim, Callie. Callie held the phone against her ear and looked out the window at the river. The July light was on it, making it bright and restless, the way rivers get in summer when the sun is high and the water is full of itself. She thought about Elara at the hearing in 1923, presenting her copies, being told they were insufficient, walking out of the room with that word already forming in her mind. Yet, not defeated, not done, just not yet. She thought about the iron box in the river roots, holding its contents for 89 years, waiting for the right hands. She thought about her mother staring at the ceiling in the dark, carrying something she never put down. She thought about the wooden box, the second one, the one she had not been looking for and found anyway, the one with the letter that said the river knows the difference between what is lost and what is waiting. When is the meeting? She asked. 2 weeks, Miriam said. The 15th. Callie wrote it down. She wrote it in the same notebook she had been using for all the other things: the attorneys' names, the document requests, the motion filing dates, the name Gerald Fitch in a box. She wrote the date on a clean line and looked at it for a moment. Then she made a cup of coffee, went out to the porch that tilted toward the river, and sat down to wait. The 2 weeks between Miriam's call and the bank meeting were the strangest of everything. The legal machinery had been running continuously for months, consuming her attention with its specific demands, documents to review, calls to return, decisions to make about arguments and evidence and strategy. Now, for the first time, there was a pause. The machinery was not stopped, but it had shifted into a different gear, one that moved without requiring her constant input, and the space this created was uncomfortable in the way that stillness can be uncomfortable when you have been moving for a long time. She went back to her water sampling work with the thoroughness she had let slip a little in the busiest months of the legal process. She drove the river corridor from the northern sampling point to the southern one, 6 stops, each one requiring 15 minutes of waiting and measuring and logging. The summer river was lower than the spring river, slower, the stones more visible, the banks more accessible. She walked them with the attention she always gave them, looking at the water, at the soil, at the vegetation, at the things that were there and the things that were not there. She stopped at the willow bend. She stood for a while. The roots where the iron box had been were visible above the waterline now, gnarled and gray, the texture of old hands. She looked at the gap between them where the box had sat for nearly a century and thought about the word that had been in the margins of the court transcript. Yet, one of her colleagues at the Water Authority, a man named Sam who had been there for 20 years and had the kind of steady, uncomplicated disposition that made him easy to be around, found her there on a Tuesday afternoon and came to stand beside her in the water. "You all right?" he asked. She thought about it. "Yeah," she said. "I think so." Sam looked at the willow roots. He knew the story everyone at the Water Authority knew. The article had seen to that, and he had said very little about it in the months since, which was one of the things she liked about him. "You know what I keep thinking about?" he said. "What?" "That box sat here through how many floods? How many high water years? Major storms. I'm thinking of at least 3 in my time on this river that should have taken everything in those roots. And it stayed." He shook his head. "That's not nothing." Callie looked at the roots. "No," she said. "It's not." She drove to the meeting on the 15th in Miriam's car, because Miriam had insisted, and because Callie's 12-year-old car had chosen the previous week to develop a noise in its front axle that suggested it would not make the 2-hour drive to the regional bank's headquarters without incident. They drove mostly in silence, the comfortable silence of 2 people who had been through a process together and did not need to fill every mile with words. The bank's headquarters was a building that communicated, in its architecture, the particular combination of solidity and restraint that large financial institutions believe is reassuring to clients. Everything was marble and dark wood and clean lines. The senior trust administration team occupied a conference room on the 14th floor with a view of the city that Callie took in briefly and then stopped looking at, because it was not the view she cared about. There were 4 people from the bank side. A woman named Claudette, who was the head of the Trust Administration Division and who ran the meeting with a precision that Callie recognized and respected. An attorney, an analyst who had apparently been tasked with the historical account reconciliation, and a man whose function was not entirely clear to Callie until he opened the folder in front of him and she understood that he was there to present numbers. Claudette opened the meeting with the formal language of institutional acknowledgement, a careful, specific statement that the bank recognized the trust instrument as valid, the chain of custody as unbroken, and Callie standing as the qualifying descendant as established by the genealogical documentation. She said this without preamble, without hedging, and without the apologetic quality that might have suggested she found it uncomfortable. She said it the way a person who has decided something says it, cleanly, as though the decision is already in the past, and this is simply the communication of it. Miriam, beside Callie, wrote something in her notebook. Then the man with the folder spoke. He presented the account reconciliation, the compounded value of the original bond instruments and investment funds, calculated through each institutional transfer and through every decade of accrual, verified against the bank's internal records and cross-referenced with the archival documentation. He was thorough and specific, and he did not rush, because the number at the end of his presentation was large enough that it deserved the precision of a long approach. The final figure was $385 million, $422,000, and some additional cents, which the man with the folder expressed as a rounded number because, he said, the full figure to the dollar was still subject to a final audit, the completion of which he anticipated within 30 days. $385 million. Callie looked at the number on the page in front of her. She had known it was coming. She had known it since February, since Miriam's office, since the first time she had done the rough calculation the night after Pete Grasso cut the hasp. Knowing it was coming did not make it feel less impossible when it arrived. It did not make the room feel less strange, or the view from the 14th floor feel less remote from the house with the tilting porch and the river below it. Claudette was speaking again, detailing the transfer process and the timeline and the documentation that would be required from Callie's side before the funds could be released. Miriam was asking precise, technical questions and writing down the answers with the focused efficiency of someone who had prepared for this conversation thoroughly and was getting what she had prepared for. Callie was looking at the window. She was thinking about Elara at the hearing in 1923, walking out of the room with the word forming in her mind. She was thinking about her mother at the diner on Route 9, carrying plates and calculations and the silent weight of what was owed. She was thinking about the river at 5 in the morning, running dark and cold and patient, holding something for 89 years with the simple, physical fidelity of a thing that does not know how to let go. Miriam touched her arm lightly. Callie. She looked up. The room was waiting for her. I'm sorry, she said. Yes. She looked at Claudette. I understand the process. I have everything you need on my end. I'll work with my attorney to get you the documentation within your required timeline. Claudette nodded. There is one additional matter, she said, and her tone shifted. Slightly not toward formality, but toward something that sounded like it might be genuine. The historical property claim. The supplemental legal instrument attached to the trust. She looked at Callie. Our legal team has reviewed the estate law of the period, and we agree with counsel's analysis that a successful trust claim triggers the statutory review provision. We will be filing a statement of support for the historical property review with the relevant county authority within 2 weeks. Callie looked at her. Elara's land, she said. Claudette nodded. The property transfer of 1923, she said, was achieved through fraudulent means, as documented in the instruments you have provided. The review provision requires a county hearing. We will support it. Callie sat with that for a moment. The land. The actual land, not just the money that had been preserved in lieu of the land, but the land itself, the process of looking at what had been done to it, the legal acknowledgement of what it had meant and who it had belonged to. Elara had not just hidden the money. She had built a mechanism to force the world to look at the injustice. And the mechanism had worked. 100 years late, it had worked. She looked at Miriam, who looked back at her with the small, precise smile she had worn when she granted the injunction. Callie looked back at Claudette. Thank you, she said. She meant it for more than the meeting. She meant it for the decision, for the clarity of it, for the clean acknowledgement of a thing that had been waiting a very long time to be acknowledged. Thank you. They drove back to Millhaven in the same comfortable silence as before, except that this time the silence had a different quality. On the way there, the silence had been the silence of preparation, two people moving towards something they did not fully know. On the way back, it was the silence of two people who have arrived somewhere and are still absorbing the fact of arrival. Miriam spoke once, about an hour from home. She said, Elara would have been a very good attorney. Callie looked out the window at the fields going past. She would have been a very good anything, Callie said, if they'd let her. Miriam nodded and drove on, and the silence returned, and the road ran ahead of them through the summer evening, and Millhaven grew closer with every mile, carrying in it all the people who had said the word speculative, and the man at the gas station, and her Aunt Barbara with her reasonable concerns, and Gerald Fitch with his 10 offers, and his 1 letter of belated goodwill, and all of it was about to change. The news reached Millhaven before Callie did. She did not know how exactly. These things move through small towns the way water moves through soil, not along visible channels, not through any single deliberate act, but through the accumulated permeability of a community that has always known everyone's business and considered this a feature rather than a flaw. By the time Miriam's car crossed the town line on the evening of the 15th, someone had already called someone who had already told someone else, and the shape of what had happened at the bank on the 14th floor was already circulating through Millhaven in the particular form that information takes when it has been passed through 5 sets of hands partially accurate, emotionally heightened, and arriving at every doorstep with the dramatic weight of something that has traveled far. What people knew was this: the bank had acknowledged the claim. What people did not yet know, what Callie had not told anyone, because she had not yet had time to tell anyone, was the full scope of what acknowledged meant. They knew the number because the number had been in the newspaper and the newspaper had been read. What they had not known, until now, was that the institution behind the number had looked at the documents and the genealogy and the court transcript and the archival corroboration and had said, in the clean, formal language of institutional decision-making, that Callie Marsh was right. That she had been right from the beginning. That the box was real, the deed was real, the trust was real, the claim was real, and Elara Harriet Marsh had been telling the truth in the hearing room of the Millhaven County Commission in November of 1923, and the woman who had found the iron box in the river roots on a cold November morning nearly a century later was her great-great-granddaughter, and she was right, and everything that had dismissed and doubted and gently pitted her was wrong. Callie pulled into her driveway as the evening light was going gold over the river. She sat in Miriam's car for a moment after the engine cut, looking at the house. The porch still tilted toward the left. The window in the kitchen still stuck in its frame from October through March. The willows along the bank were full and heavy with summer, their branches moving in the light wind off the water. Everything looked exactly the same, and nothing was the same at all. She got out of the car and went inside and made coffee and stood at the kitchen counter looking at the iron box, which sat where it always sat now, on the counter where she could see it, its lid open, the oilskin wrapping spread around it like hands that had let go of something precious and were resting now. She looked at it for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called her Aunt Barbara. Barbara picked up on the second ring. She had clearly already heard something, because her voice when she answered had the quality of a person standing at the edge of a fact they are not quite ready to step into. "Callie," she said, "I've been hearing things." "The bank acknowledged the claim," Callie said. "The trust is valid. The funds are real. The transfer process starts in 30 days. There was a silence. On Barbara's end. A long one. The kind of silence that is not empty, but full of the specific weight of a person absorbing the fact that they were wrong, and understanding the dimensions of how wrong, and doing the private internal work of standing inside that understanding without trying to immediately reduce it to something more comfortable. Callie did not fill the silence. She let it be what it was. Barbara's voice, when it came back, was different. Not the voice of the woman who had sat at the kitchen table with her reasonable concerns and her open palms and her "be sensible, honey." It was older than that voice. Quieter. "Your mother would have," she started, and then stopped. She tried again. "Dina always said you saw things other people didn't." She used to say it like she was proud of it, even when it frustrated her. She said it like you got it from her mother and her mother's mother, all the way back. Like it was something that ran in the family. She stopped again. Callie waited. "I should have believed you," Barbara said. "I should have said that a long time ago." Callie looked out the window at the river. "I know," she said. "It's all right. It wasn't a dismissal. It was true. It was all right." Forgiveness was not a complicated thing when the person asking for it had arrived at it honestly, without excuses, without the renegotiation of history that people sometimes attempt in order to make their past behavior more understandable than it actually was. Barbara had simply said she was wrong, and that was enough, and the distance between them that had grown in the months of not being believed contracted now to something crossable. She called Pete Grasso after Barbara. He answered on the first ring and said congratulations before she had said anything, which meant he had already heard, which meant the whole town had heard, which she had expected. "You remember you owe me $50, he said. "I remember," she said. "I'll do better than that." He laughed. She laughed. It was the easiest conversation she had had in months. She did not sleep much that night. Not because she was anxious. The anxiety had been the companion of the months of process, of waiting and filing and not knowing. And it had lifted now with the strange completeness of a weather system that has finally moved through. She was not anxious. She was awake in the way that you are awake when something has shifted so fundamentally that your body has not yet learned how to rest inside the new configuration. She lay in her mother's bed in her mother's house and listened to the river and thought about all of it, about Elara and the hearing and the box and the roots and the word, yet in the margin of the court transcript, and at some point before dawn she fell asleep and did not dream, or if she dreamed she did not remember it. And when she woke, the sun was already over the tree line, and the river was bright in the morning light, and everything was still changed. The 30 days that followed were the busiest of her life. The bank's process required documentation at every stage, notarized affidavits, genealogical certifications, legal authorizations for the transfer mechanisms, tax filings at multiple levels, and the ongoing coordination between Miriam's office and the bank's trust administration team that generated, by Callie's rough count, more paper than everything she had accumulated in the previous year combined. She signed things in Miriam's conference room. She signed things at the county clerk's office. She signed things at the bank's regional branch, at a desk across from a woman named Patricia who treated every signature with the reverence of someone who understood that they were witnessing something that did not happen every month. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The historical property review was a separate process, parallel to the trust transfer, moving through the county commission's hearing schedule with the deliberate pace of an institution that did not like being asked to look at its own history. Miriam had filed the petition the day after the bank meeting, incorporating the court transcript, the authenticated documents, the bank's statement of support, and a detailed legal brief arguing that the 1923 property transfer met the statutory standard for fraudulent conveyance under the estate laws of the period. The county attorney's office had 30 days to respond. They used all 30. Their response was careful. It did not dispute the authenticity of the documents. It did not dispute the genealogical connection. What it argued, in the particular language of institutional self-preservation, was that the remedies available under the historical review provision were limited, that a finding of fraudulent conveyance would create a record of the fraud, but might not automatically restore title to the property as it existed in 1923, given the subsequent transfers and developments that had occurred over a century. It was, Miriam explained to Callie, a reasonable legal argument in a narrow technical sense, and the narrowness of the sense in which it was reasonable was going to be the field on which the hearing was fought. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in September. The county commission chamber was a wood-paneled room that smelled of old paper and deliberation, the kind of room that had hosted decisions both good and bad over the course of its existence, and wore the evidence of both in the scuffs on the floor and the weight in the air. Callie arrived early with Miriam and David Rowe, who had asked to attend as an observer and whose presence, Miriam noted, was not unwelcome given that he represented the institutional credibility of the State Historical Society's corroboration. The chamber filled. That was the first thing Callie noticed that was different from what she had expected. She had expected a formal proceeding with the sparse attendance of an administrative hearing that most people had no reason to care about. Instead, the seats were full. Millhaven had turned out. Not just the usual meeting attendees, the civically engaged regulars who came to planning board hearings and zoning discussions, but people Callie recognized from the diner, from the hardware store, from the gas station where the man had said she made it up. People who had read the newspaper stories and had opinions, and had apparently decided that those opinions were worth a Thursday morning. She recognized Frances Beale from the Historical Society, sitting straight-backed in the second row with a folder on her lap. She recognized Sam from the Water Authority, looking slightly uncomfortable in a button-down shirt as though he had not worn one in some time, which she suspected was accurate. She recognized, in the back row, Ron Bellamy from the bait shop, who had told the journalist that she had always been the type to see things that weren't there. He was looking at the floor. She did not see Gerald Fitch. She found out later that he had submitted a written statement to the commission in advance of the hearing. She would read it afterward, and it was, given everything, one of the more surprising documents she encountered in the entire process. It said, in summary, that he wished to withdraw all offers to purchase the Marsh property, that he supported the historical review process and its outcome regardless of what that outcome might be, and that he wanted to state for the record that his father had always believed, though he had not said so publicly, that the original transfer of the property had been achieved through means that were, at minimum, ethically questionable. He did not use the word fraud, but he did not use it, either. The shape of what he was saying was legible without it. She thought about him reading his father's private belief in some document or conversation she would never have access to, and understanding what it meant, and choosing to say something about it at the only moment when saying something might matter. She did not forgive Gerald Fitch. Forgiveness was not the right word for what she felt about a man who had spent 2 years trying to force her out of her home through the mechanism of her family's financial distress. But she acknowledged, privately, that he had done the right thing when the right thing cost him something. That was worth acknowledging. Miriam presented the case in 2 hours. She was methodical and precise, and, at certain moments, quietly devastating, particularly when she read aloud a portion of Elara's 1923 testimony describing the specific documents that had been submitted to the commission as genuine but were, as the authenticated evidence now proved, not the originals but copies that had been altered. The altered copies were not available for comparison, having been lost or destroyed in the intervening century. But the originals, recovered from the iron box, were in the room, and Miriam laid them out on the presentation table with the care of someone handling things that deserved to be handled carefully. She also read, toward the end of her presentation, the passage from Elara's second letter, the one from the wooden box, the one that had said the river knows the difference between what is lost and what is waiting. She read it without commentary, without framing it as argument. She simply read it, and let it be what it was, and the room was very quiet when she finished. The county attorney made his technical arguments. They were sound in the way that technical arguments are sound when they are well constructed, and the construction is the only interesting thing about them. Miriam responded to each one with the precision of someone who had anticipated them all, which she had. The commission withdrew to deliberate. Callie sat in the chamber and looked at the wood paneling and the scuffed floor and the light coming through the high windows, and she did not try to read the outcome in anything she could see. She was past that kind of reading. She had learned, in the months of process, to be patient in the specific way that Elara had apparently also been patient, not the passive patience of someone waiting for the world to act, but the active patience of someone who has done everything that can be done and is now simply present for whatever comes next. Sam sat down beside her while the commission was deliberating. He did not say anything. He just sat there, which was what she needed, and she was grateful for it. The commission returned after 40 minutes. The chair, a woman named Helen Goss who had been on the commission for 16 years and had the manner of someone who understood the weight of what commissions are asked to decide, read the finding in the formal language of institutional decision. The finding was that the 1923 property transfer had been achieved through fraudulent means as defined by the estate statutes of the period. The finding was that the original title to the property remained, under the legal principles governing fraudulent conveyance, with the heirs of Elara Harriet Marsh. The finding was that the current title record would be corrected to reflect this determination, and that all subsequent transfers derived from the fraudulent 1923 transaction would be reviewed under the corrective mechanism established in the trust instrument. It was not everything. The corrective mechanism was complex, and the century of subsequent transfers meant that certain properties could not simply be returned. They had been developed, subdivided, sold to parties who had no knowledge of the original fraud. Those situations would require individual legal proceedings, each one its own complicated thing. Miriam had explained this from the beginning, and Callie had understood, and she had made her peace with it. She was not trying to undo 100 years of the world. She was trying to establish the truth of what Elara had said in that hearing room in 1923, and the commission had established it, and that was what mattered. The marsh land, the land the house sat on, the river frontage, the property that Gerald Fitch had been trying to acquire for 2 years was formally, legally, and without further contest confirmed as hers. The chamber was quiet for a moment after Helen Goss finished reading. Then it was not quiet, because the people in the seats were people from Millhaven, and Millhaven had opinions, and the opinion in the room in that moment was not unanimous. Because no room of humans is ever unanimous, but overwhelmingly in the direction of something that sounded like relief. Like the release of a tension that had been building not for months, but for decades, for generations, for as long as the wrong had been sitting there unacknowledged. Callie stood up. Miriam put a hand on her arm briefly, not to stop her, but to steady her, and then removed it, because Callie did not need steadying. She was steady. She had been steady for a long time. She walked out of the chamber into the September morning, and the light was the particular clean light of early fall, and the air smelled of cooling leaves and the faint, distant smell of the river, which was always present in Millhaven, which had always been there underneath everything, patient and dark and continuous. She stood on the courthouse steps and let herself feel it, not triumph. Exactly, which was too simple a word for something this complicated. Something more like completion. The sensation of a thing that has been open for a very long time finally, gently, closing. People came out of the courthouse behind her. Some of them said things to her congratulations, and I always believed you, which was not entirely true, but which she received graciously because the spirit of it was honest. And some of them said nothing, but stood nearby in the way that people stand nearby when they want to be part of a moment without claiming more of it than belongs to them. Frances Beale from the Historical Society shook her hand with both of hers and said that she intended to write a detailed account of the case for the county historical record, and that she hoped Callie would speak with her at length. Callie said she would. Sam stood at the bottom of the steps with his hands in his pockets and his button-down shirt and said congratulations again, and then said he had to get back for afternoon sampling. And she said, of course, go, and watched him walk to his truck with the comfortable, unhurried stride of a man who was exactly where he was supposed to be. Ron Bellamy from the bait shop walked past her on his way to his car. He stopped. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has something to say and is not entirely sure how to say it, which was perhaps not a familiar position for him. I was wrong, he said, about what I said to the paper. His voice had the stiffness of a man who does not apologize often and is finding the mechanism unfamiliar. I should not have said that. Callie looked at him. No, she said. You shouldn't have. He nodded once and walked on. It was not a dramatic moment. It was not a movie moment of tearful reconciliation. It was just a man saying he was wrong in 4 words and a woman accepting it in 3. And that was exactly the right size for what it was. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The trust funds transferred on a Tuesday morning in October, in the functional and undramatic way that very large sums of money move in the modern world through wire instructions and account numbers and confirmation codes, without ceremony, without the physical weight that the word fortune implies. Miriam's office called at 9:14 to confirm that the transfer had been completed and the funds were in the account that had been established for the purpose. Callie thanked her and hung up and sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and her iron box and the morning light coming through the window, and she waited for the moment to feel as large as it was. It felt large. It felt very large. But it felt large in a quiet way. The way the river feels large when you are standing at its edge in the early morning, not the largeness of spectacle, but the largeness of depth, of something that extends further than you can see and runs deeper than you can reach. She had been thinking for months about what she would do, not in the abstract way of imagining wealth as a solution to a problem, as a number that would replace all the other numbers that had been too small for too long. She had been thinking specifically, practically, in the way that her mother had thought about money as a tool, as a responsibility, as something that had a direction it needed to go, and that going in that direction was not a passive act, but an active one. She started with the house. Not renovation, it did not need renovation. It needed attention, the kind of patient, skilled attention that a house, which has been held together by stubbornness for a generation, deserves. She hired a local crew, people from Millhaven, and told them specifically what she wanted. The porch straightened, yes, but not replaced. The window frame fixed. So it opened all year, but kept. The chimney pointed and the roof properly sealed, and the foundation checked by someone who understood old construction. She told them she did not want the house to look new. She wanted it to look like what it was, a house that had been here a long time and intended to be here a long time more. The contractor who ran the crew was a man in his 50s named Earl who had been doing this kind of work in Millhaven for 30 years and who listened to her describe what she wanted with the focused expression of a craftsman receiving a commission he respects. You want it preserved, not restored, he said. Yes, she said. Exactly that. He nodded. He understood the difference. Not everyone did. While the housework began, Callie drove to the cemetery where her mother was buried and where her grandmother was buried beside her, and where, a few rows further on, her grandmother's mother was buried. She sat for a while on the bench that the cemetery kept near the older section for people who needed to stay a while, and she talked, out loud, to the quiet air above the graves, the way you talk to people when you understand that the talking is for you and not for them, but that does not make it less true. She told her mother about the bank meeting. She told her about the commission hearing, about Helen Goss reading the finding, about the light on the courthouse steps in September. She told her about Elara's second letter and the word yet in the margin and the photograph of the woman with the posture of someone who has decided, permanently, not to be diminished. She told her that the house was being taken care of. She sat for a long time after she ran out of words. The cemetery was quiet in the October way, leaves coming down in the occasional light wind, the sky a thin clear blue, the silence of a place that has made its peace with the nature of things. She drove back to Millhaven and went to work. The County Water Authority received, in October, an anonymous donation of $250,000 designated for the expansion of its river corridor monitoring program, 3 additional sampling stations, updated equipment, and the funding for a new permanent position focused on historical water quality data analysis. The donation came with one condition: that the position be filled by someone who understood the river not just as a data source, but as something worth understanding on its own terms. Callie's supervisor called her, his voice containing a quality she had not heard in it before, a kind of careful wonder. "We got a donation," he said. "Big one. For the program, for a new position. Do you know anything about this?" She told him she had heard something about it, and thought it was a good idea. He was quiet for a moment. "Callie," he said, "I need to think about what I want to do next," she said. "I'll let you know." She had been thinking about this since before the transfer, in the months of process when she had nothing to do but wait, and the waiting gave her time to ask the questions she had been too busy to ask before. What did she actually want to do with the rest of her life? Not with the money, that was a separate question, with its own answers, many of which she had already begun to act on, but with the life itself, with the days of it, with the mornings. She wanted the river. She understood that as clearly as she understood anything. She wanted to be on it in the early mornings with her rubber boots and her collection jars and her notebook, taking samples, logging temperatures, watching the water for the things that were there and the things that were not. She wanted to do that work with the seriousness it deserved, not as a part-time county employee, but as someone who had the resources and the standing and the institutional backing to do it properly, over time, with the depth of attention that a living system requires when you want to actually understand it. She incorporated a foundation in November. She named it the Elara Marsh River Conservation Trust, which Miriam said was a perfectly sound legal name, and David Rose said was exactly right. The foundation's purpose was the long-term ecological study and protection of the river corridor, not the river as a resource, not the river as a potential revenue stream, but the river as a living system with its own integrity and its own claim on the attention of the people who lived alongside it. She endowed it with $40 million, which was enough to operate in perpetuity at the level of work she envisioned, with a board of directors that included David Rowe, Francis Beale, Sam from the Water Authority, and 3 scientists from the regional university whose work on freshwater ecosystems she had been reading for years and who, when she called them, turned out to be the kind of people who could not say yes fast enough when the offer was explained. The river, Callie told the board at their first meeting, is not a backdrop. It is not scenery. It is not a feature that makes the property more valuable. It is a system, and it is alive, and it has been doing things we do not fully understand for longer than we have been here to watch it. Our job is to watch it better." She paused. "It kept a secret for 89 years, she said. "The least we can do is take it seriously." The foundation hired 3 full-time researchers in its first year. It established a public data portal where anyone could access the river monitoring information in real time. It partnered with the elementary school in Millhaven to develop a curriculum around river ecology, which meant that every 4th grade class spent 2 mornings a year at the river's edge with rubber boots and collection jars, and a researcher who treated their questions as worth answering completely. Callie taught the first class herself. She stood at the bank on a cold morning in March with 12 9-year-olds arrayed around her in various states of enthusiasm about the rubber boots, and she showed them how to collect a water sample without disturbing the silt, how to read the turbidity of the water by holding the jar to the light, how to record a temperature precisely, how to look at a body of water and see it as a thing with a history rather than a thing that simply exists. One girl, small and serious, with the focused expression of a child who has decided to pay attention, asked Callie why the river mattered. Callie thought about the iron box. She thought about the willow roots. She thought about Elara at the river's edge in 1927 with the box in her arms, trusting the water to hold it. "Because it remembers things," Callie said. "Because it keeps what you give it, if you give it the right way." The girl looked at the river with the expression of someone storing information. What did it keep? She asked. Callie looked at the river too. Everything, she said. The property questioned the full scope of the historical review, and what could and could not be returned took another year to resolve through the individual proceedings that Miriam had anticipated. Some land could not be returned. It had been built on, subdivided, sold in good faith to families who had done nothing wrong. For those properties, the Commission established a compensatory framework money from the trust designated for the purpose, distributed through a process that Miriam oversaw with the thoroughness she applied to everything. It was not perfect. It was not the restoration of a century of lost accumulation. It was an acknowledgement, translated into the language of money because money was the language the law spoke, that a wrong had been done and something was owed. Callie did not find this satisfying in the way that completeness is satisfying, but she found it true, which was not the same thing and was in some ways more important. The truth of what had been done had been established. The record said it clearly and permanently. Whatever could be corrected had been corrected, and whatever could not be corrected had been acknowledged, and Elara's testimony in the hearing room of 1923 had finally been heard by an institution capable of hearing it. Yet, Callie thought, remembering the word in the margin, she had read it as stubbornness. She understood now that it was also prophecy. She paid off the back taxes on the Marsh property on the day the transfer cleared, not because they were owed anymore. The injunction had handled that, but because she wanted the record to show it. She wanted there to be a payment receipt in the county file, dated October of the year the claim resolved, in the name of Callie Marsh, for taxes on the property that Elara Harriet Marsh had purchased in 1902. She wanted the bureaucratic record to close cleanly, without loose ends, every column balanced. It was a small thing. It was also exactly the kind of thing her mother would have done. She repaired the dock along the riverbank, the old one that had been rotting slowly for years. She repaired it with the same philosophy she had given Earl for the house preserved, not restored. The same wood where the wood could be saved, new timber where it could not, fitted together with the care that good carpentry requires, designed to hold for another generation rather than simply to look good for the next few years. She spent several evenings down there while the work was going on, sitting at the edge in the dusk, watching the water. She found herself thinking, on those evenings, not about the claim or the hearing or the transfer or any of the things that had occupied her so completely for the better part of a year. She found herself thinking about her mother coming home from the diner at 8 in the morning and going directly to the bookkeeping job, and coming home in the evening and sitting at the kitchen table with the accounts and the bills and the coffee that always went cold before she finished it. The way she had made all of it look like simply what a person does, simply the ordinary texture of a life. Even when the numbers were wrong and the margin was disappearing and the river house was the one thing she was holding on to with both hands. Callie had not understood, when she was young, what it cost to make something look easy when it was not easy. She understood now. She understood it in the specific, somatic way that you understand a thing when you have done it yourself, when you have stood in a room being told you are wrong and maintained the stillness of someone who knows they are right and can wait. When you have held a piece of paper with an impossible number on it and not shown anyone that your hands were not entirely steady. When you have driven 2 hours to a bank meeting and sat across from people with institutional authority and said, clearly and without deference, here is what is true. Her mother had done that every day, not in courtrooms or bank conference rooms, but in the diner and the hardware store and the kitchen with the stuck window and the cold coffee. Every day, with the same stubbornness, the same conviction, the same refusal to accept the framing that said the Marsh family's circumstances were the natural consequence of who the Marsh family was rather than the result of something that had been deliberately done to them a century ago. Dina Marsh had not known about the iron box. She had not known about the trust, or the deed, or Elara's testimony, or the word yet in the margin of the court transcript. She had held on because she was a Marsh and Marshes held on, because the house was hers and the river was hers, and some knowledge is so deep in the bone that it does not require documentation. Callie sat on the repaired dock in the October dark and said out loud, to the water and the willows and the particular quality of silence that a river creates at night. She was right. Mom, she was right all along. And she thought she heard something in the current, some shift in the sound of the water moving over the stones, That was not quite language, and was not quite silence, and was exactly the right response. She established a scholarship in her mother's name at the community college where she had taken night classes, the Dina Marsh Environmental Studies Scholarship, funded at a level that would cover full tuition and materials for 2 students per year indefinitely, designated specifically for first-generation college students who were already working while they studied. The scholarship committee received, in its first year, 47 applications. They selected 2. Both were women. Both were working morning shifts at local diners to pay their rent. Callie attended the award ceremony and shook both of their hands and did not make a speech, because the money was not about her and the scholarship was not about her, and she was tired of the sound of her own story told out loud. What she did do, when one of the students asked her privately how she had kept going through all of it, was tell the truth. "I didn't feel like I had a choice," she said. "And then I understood that not having a choice is sometimes the thing that makes you strongest. Because you can't waste energy deciding. You just do the next thing." The student looked at her with the focused attention of someone storing information. "What's the next thing?" she asked. Callie smiled. "It changes," she said. "But it's always the next thing. You figure it out when you get there." She went back to the river in the mornings. She went back to the rubber boots and the collection jars and the notebook, not as a county employee now, but as the director of the foundation she had built, which meant she had more resources and more support and more continuity than she had ever had before, and it still felt exactly the same: the cold of the water through the rubber, the smell of the bank in the early morning, the particular quality of attention that the river demanded and that she was always willing to give. She stopped at the Willow Bend most mornings. She did not always stay long. Sometimes she took her sample and logged her reading and moved on, the river's schedule being what it was. But she stopped. She looked at the roots. She thought about what they had held and for how long and with what fidelity, and she was grateful to them in the way that you are grateful to something that cannot receive gratitude but deserves it anyway. The iron box stayed on the kitchen counter. She had been asked, more than once by the Historical Society, by a museum 2 cities over that had heard about the case and expressed interest in the collection, whether she would consider donating it or lending it for display. She said she would think about it, which was true, and she thought about it, and she decided no. Not permanently, not now. The box had been out of the house for most of a century. It had earned the right to stay. She put Elara's photograph on the wall above the kitchen table, in a frame that Francis Beale had recommended and that a framer in town had fitted with conservation glass to protect the image from light damage. The photograph showed the woman with the posture of someone who has decided, permanently, not to be diminished, standing in front of the house that was also Callie's house. In the year 1924, a year before she had placed the first box in the river, and a year before she had placed the second box downstream as confirmation. She looked at it every morning over her coffee. She looked at the posture and the expression and the way the house stood behind the woman as though it were an extension of her, as though the house and the woman were the same kind of thing, made of the same material, built with the same intention, designed to last beyond what anyone who did not know better would think possible. She thought about what Elara had carried in those years. The loss of her husband, the loss of her land, the years of rented rooms and legal defeats, and the particular kind of poverty that comes to people who have been robbed rather than people who have simply been unfortunate, who know what they had and cannot forget it. All of that, and still she had been careful. Still she had built the mechanism. Still she had trusted the river and the roots and the person who would come, eventually, looking. The faith of that, the patience of it, the love in it, across whatever distance. Millhaven settled, as towns do, into a new understanding of Callie Marsh. Not a transformation. Towns do not transform so much as they adjust, shifting their weight from one foot to the other and pretending they had been balanced all along. She did not become, suddenly, someone whose claims went unquestioned or whose presence was universally celebrated. She became, instead, someone the town had a more complicated shape for, someone who had been right when they said she was wrong. Someone who had gone to the river with her rubber boots in the dark of November and come up with something that changed everything. Someone who had stood in a bank conference room, in a county commission chamber, in a courthouse, and said, "Here is what is true," until the institutions agreed. That was enough. She did not need more than that. She needed the river in the morning. She needed the house with the porch that no longer tilted because Earl had fixed it, but that still felt like the same porch, because a repaired thing is still the thing it was. She needed the iron box on the counter, and Elara on the wall, and the memory of her mother making coffee in the dark. She needed the Water Authority's expanded monitoring program and the Foundation's board meetings and the 9-year-olds in rubber boots at the river's edge asking questions that deserved complete answers. She needed, sometimes, in the evenings when the light was going off the river and the willows were moving in the last of the day's wind, to stand on the repaired dock and look at the water and feel the full depth of what it had held and what it had given and what it was still, in its patient and continuous way, becoming. The river did not stop. That was the thing about rivers. They did not stop for grief or for victory or for the resolution of historical claims or for the end of a process that had taken a year of her life and 89 years before that. They ran on, dark and cold and patient and full of the things that had been given to them, keeping what they held, carrying what they carried, moving always towards something that was not an ending but a continuation. She stood there one evening in the late fall, the air with the first real cold of the season in it, the river running high with recent rain. She stood there and she thought about all of it, the whole long shape of it, from Elara kneeling at this same edge in 1927 to Callie kneeling here in November, a century later, pulling an iron box out of the roots with both hands. The distance between those two moments and everything that had happened in it. The women along the chain of it, Elara and her daughter and her daughter's daughter and Dina and Callie, each one holding something, each one passing it forward, each one more stubborn than the world expected. The river moved around the dock posts. The willows made their sound in the wind. The dark came down over the water, and the water went on running, carrying its cold and its memory and its long, unbroken knowledge of the bank and the roots and the things that had been trusted to it. Callie Marsh stood on her dock at the edge of her river on her land, the land that had always been hers, the land that had known it all along, and she breathed the cold air in, and she breathed it out, and she was home. The letter arrived on a Wednesday in December, 6 weeks after the trust funds had transferred and 4 weeks after the commission had entered its final order into the county record. It came in a plain envelope, no return address, postmarked from a town Callie did not recognize, written on paper that had been folded and refolded enough times that the creases had softened to the texture of cloth. The handwriting was old, but not ancient, the handwriting of someone in their 70s or 80s who had learned to write at a time when penmanship was still considered a discipline worth mastering. The letters were precise, slightly forward-leaning, the kind of script that takes its time with each word as though each word deserves to be set down carefully. The letter said, "My name is Ruth Coates Hadley. My grandfather was Samuel Coates. He was the attorney who drew up Elara Marsh's trust in 1924. I have followed the proceedings in the newspaper, and I have been trying to decide for 3 months whether to write this letter. I have decided that I should. There are things I know about your great-great-grandmother that are not in any document and that I believe you would want to know. If you are willing to meet, I am willing to drive. I am 81 years old, and I still drive my own car, which I mention not to impress you, but to answer the question you are probably asking, which is whether I am able to come to you. I am. Please write back if you would like to arrange it." Callie read the letter twice at the kitchen table. Then she looked at Elara's photograph on the wall. Then she went and found a piece of paper and wrote back the same day. Ruth Coates Hadley arrived on a Saturday morning in January, in a green sedan that she parked with precision in the driveway. Emerging with a cane, she clearly used more as a precaution than a necessity and a canvas bag over one shoulder that had the weight of something significant inside it. She was a small woman, with white hair cut close and eyes that had the quality of eyes that have seen a great deal and are not surprised by much. She stood in the driveway and looked at the house at the repaired porch, the river beyond, the willows heavy with winter with an expression that was not quite recognition, but something adjacent to it, the expression of a person encountering a place they know from description rather than experience. Callie came out to meet her. They shook hands on the porch. Ruth's hand was dry and firm. "It looks like he described it," Ruth said, still looking at the house. "Who?" Callie asked. "My grandfather. He wrote about coming here." She turned to look at Callie with those clear, unsurprised eyes. "He wrote about her, too. He wrote about her for the rest of his life." They went inside. Callie made tea, and Ruth sat at the kitchen table and set the canvas bag carefully on the floor beside her chair, and she looked at the iron box on the counter for a long moment without speaking. "You kept it out," she said finally. "It stays out," Callie said. Ruth nodded as though this was the correct answer. She began talking then, in the measured way of someone who has organized what they need to say over a long period of preparation and is now delivering it in the order they decided on during that preparation. Her grandfather, she said, had not been a man who talked about his work at home. Attorneys of his era and in his practice did not do that. But Elara Marsh had been different. Elara had been the exception to that professional discretion, the one case that followed him out of the office and into the kitchen and into the quiet hours of his evenings for the rest of his life. He used to say, Ruth told Callie, that he had failed her. That no matter what she had built afterward, the trust, the mechanism, the boxes in the river, he had failed her in the hearing room in 1923, and that failure was something he carried. Callie looked at the canvas bag beside Ruth's chair. He was not wrong, Ruth said, that he failed her. He was wrong about what the failure meant. She paused, but he didn't live to understand that. He died in 1971, which was before any of this. She gestured at the room, meaning everything the room contained, the box and the photograph and the resolution and the foundation and the scholarship and all the rest of it. She reached into the canvas bag and removed, with the careful handling of someone who has been thinking about this moment for a long time, a small-bound volume. The cover was worn dark leather, the spine reinforced with tape that had yellowed and dried, but was still holding. His journals, she said, the professional ones. He kept them from 1919 until 1968. She set the volume on the table between them. The entries about your family are marked. There are 37 of them, spread over 40 years. Callie put her hands flat on the table and looked at the journal and did not reach for it immediately, because it required a moment, the understanding of what it was, the understanding that here was another layer of the story, another set of documents that had been kept and preserved and carried forward by someone who understood that the keeping mattered even when the reason for the keeping was not entirely clear. Ruth watched her. He loved her, Ruth said, simply. Not romantically, I want to be clear about that, because it would be easy to misread it, and it would not be accurate. He loved her the way you love someone whose dignity you have witnessed at close range under conditions designed to eliminate it. He sat across from her in that hearing room in 1923 and watched her present her case, and he watched the commission deny it on procedural grounds, and he watched her stand up and gather her papers without showing anyone in that room what it cost her. And he said he wrote it that same night. It's in the journal. He said he had never seen anyone more completely herself in the face of a world that was trying to tell them they were wrong about who they were. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Callie looked at the photograph on the wall. The posture, the expression that was not quite a smile. He helped her build the trust, Ruth continued, and he helped her draft the mechanism, and he told her, because he was an honest man and honesty was the one thing his failure in the hearing room had not taken from him, that he did not know if it would ever be used, that the chain of events required was long, that a great deal could go wrong. She told him she understood all of that. She told him she was not building it because she expected it to succeed. She was building it because it was true, and a true thing deserved to be built even if no one was there to see it become complete. She paused. He wrote that down word for word, Ruth said. He thought it was the most important thing anyone had ever said to him in a professional context, and possibly outside one. Callie opened the journal then, because the moment had settled enough that reaching for it felt right. The entries were in the same precise handwriting as the letter Ruth had sent, the family resemblance of penmanship, the forward-leaning, careful script. The marked entries were flagged with small strips of paper, yellowed now, placed there by Ruth or perhaps by Samuel himself. She could not tell which. She turned to the first marked entry, dated November 14, 1923, 3 days after the commission hearing. I have failed EHM. The procedural ruling was correct under the technical standard, and I knew when I presented the evidence that it was insufficient, and I presented it anyway, because it was all we had. She presented it without flinching. She was more dignified in defeat than her opponents were in victory, which is always the clearest indication of where the actual justice lies. I do not know how to carry this, she wrote. She set the journal down. Ruth was watching her with the expression of a woman who has given something away that she had been holding for a long time and is taking stock of how it feels to have given it. There is one more thing, Ruth said. She reached into the canvas bag again. This was not in the journal. She produced a small envelope, sealed, with Callie's name written on the front in the same precise script as the letter Ruth had sent, but older. The paper of the envelope had the texture and color of something from a previous era. "My grandfather left this in his will," Ruth said, with instructions that it was to be delivered to whoever successfully claimed the trust. He wrote it in 1968, 3 years before he died. He did not know if it would ever be delivered. He left it anyway. "Because a true thing deserves to be built," Callie said. Ruth looked at her steadily. "Even if no one is there to see it become complete," she agreed. Callie held the envelope for a moment. Then she opened it. The letter inside was short, half a page, the handwriting slightly less precise than the journal entries, the hand of an older man, but still controlled, still deliberate. It said, "If you are reading this, then she was right. She was right about the river, and she was right about the roots, and she was right about the person who would come, and I was right only about the one thing that mattered least, which was whether it would be difficult. It was. But you did it. I am sorry I could not do more for her. I am glad someone could. The land remembers. She told me that the first day I met her, standing in my office on a cold morning in January of 1922, and I did not know what to make of it then. I know now that she was right about that, too. Be well. Take care of the river." It took care of what mattered most. Callie set the letter down on the table beside the journal beside the iron box and looked at the three of them together, the box that had started everything, the journal that had been carried for 50 years in the hope of this moment, the letter written by an old man to a person whose face he would never see, and she felt the full, specific weight of all the people who had contributed to the chain of it. Not just Elara. Samuel Coates, who had failed and carried the failure and built the letter anyway. Ruth Hadley, 81 years old, who had followed the newspaper story and decided to drive. Her mother Dina, who had held on to the house without knowing why the holding mattered beyond the fact that it was theirs. Her grandmother, her grandmother's mother, all of them carrying something forward in the dark without knowing if the person who needed it would ever arrive to receive it. She looked up at Ruth. "Will you stay for lunch?" she asked. Ruth Hadley said yes. They talked for 4 hours. Ruth told her things about Samuel Coates that were not in the journals, the man he had been outside his professional life. The way he had talked about the Marsh case at the dinner table when Ruth was young, even though he was careful to keep the details professional. The way the case had shaped his understanding of what the law was supposed to be and what it too often was instead. Callie told Ruth about finding the box, about Pete Grasso's workshop and the sparks from the grinder, about the second box downstream and the letter that had set across whatever distance. She told her about the word, yet in the margin of the court transcript. Ruth closed her eyes when Callie told her about the word. She kept them closed for a moment. "He would have wanted to know that," she said. "He would have wanted to know she wrote that." Callie thought about all the people who had wanted to know things they would never know. All the gaps in the chain where the information had not passed through because the time was not right or the person was not there or the document had not yet been found. All the things that Elara had wanted to know, whether the box held, whether the roots held, whether the person came and had not lived to find out. The not knowing was part of it, she thought. The building in the dark without seeing the completion was part of what made the thing worth building. If Elara had known it would work, if Samuel Coates had known the letter would be delivered, if her mother had known what the house was standing on, the holding would have been easier, and the easy holding would have been a different kind of thing. What made it what it was, what made all of it what it was that they had done it without knowing. They had done it on trust, on the particular faith of people who understand that a true thing deserves to exist whether or not they are there to see it recognized. Ruth left in the late afternoon, when the winter light was going flat and golden over the river and the cold was settling back in after the brief warmth of the house. She stood by her green sedan in the driveway and looked at the river one more time. "He was right about this place," she said. "What did he say about it?" Callie asked. "She said it was the kind of place that knew what it was," Ruth said. "Some places don't. You can feel it when a place doesn't. They feel temporary, contingent, like they're waiting to be something other than what they are." She looked at the house, the willows, the water. "He said this place knew." She looked at Callie. "I think he was right." She got in her car and drove carefully out of the driveway and up the road and out of sight. And Callie stood in the cold watching her go and thinking about a man who had sat in an office in 1922 and listened to a woman tell him that the land remembers and had not known what to make of it and had spent the rest of his life finding out. She went inside. She sat at the kitchen table with the journal and the letter in the iron box, and she opened the journal to the last marked entry, the one Ruth had flagged with the final strip of paper. It was dated March 3rd, 1968, 3 years before Samuel Coates died. The handwriting was slower than the earlier entries, more effortful, but the intention behind each word was still precise. He had written, "I am leaving the letter as instructed. I do not know if the chain will hold. I know that she believed it would, and her believing was the most reliable thing I encountered in 40 years of practice, so I am extending that credit forward into a future I will not see. If the letter arrives, then the chain held. If it does not, then it was still worth writing, because she was worth writing it for, and the act of writing it is the only thing that was ever entirely mine to give. I have given it. I am at peace with the shape of what I could do." Callie closed the journal. She went to the window and looked at the river in the last of the daylight. The water was high with winter runoff, dark and fast. The willows bare-branched along the bank, the roots submerged again, holding the bank the way they held it every winter, the way they had held it every winter for 100 years and more. She thought about chains. Not the chains that bind, but the chains that carry, the ones that pass something forward through time with the particular fidelity of people who understand that what they are holding is not theirs to keep, but theirs to transmit. Samuel Coates transmitting across 50 years in an envelope. Elara transmitting across 90 in an iron box. Her mother transmitting without knowing what she was transmitting, simply by holding on to the house and the river and the stubbornness that ran through the marsh line like water through stone. She thought about what she was transmitting. The foundation, yes. The scholarship. The restored house and the repaired dock and the expanded monitoring program and the data portal where anyone could look at the river in real time and see it as a living system rather than a backdrop. Those were transmissions. They were the things she was building in her own present against a future she would not see. But she was also transmitting something less tangible and more important, the thing that Elara had transmitted to her mother and her mother to her, without any of them knowing it was happening, the thing that had made each one of them capable of the particular kind of holding that the chain required. The knowledge, cellular and specific, that a true thing deserves to be built, that the building matters regardless of who sees it become complete, that the river, any force that is larger than you and older than you and more patient than you will keep what you give it, if you give it the right way. She was transmitting that. She understood it in this moment, clearly, the way you understand something when you are standing inside the full shape of it for the first time, that the work she was doing with the foundation and the scholarship and the monitoring program was not primarily about the river or about money or even about justice, though it was about all of those things. It was about demonstrating, in the specific and tangible language of action, that the thing Elara had believed was worth believing, that the trust had not been misplaced, that the world contained, alongside all its capacity for fraud and dismissal and institutional indifference, the possibility of something else, the possibility of a person who would come to the river's edge and look in the right direction and pull the box out of the roots with both hands and know, without being told, that what she held mattered. She was transmitting the knowledge that such a person was possible, because she was that person, and the demonstration of a possible thing is the most powerful argument for its possibility. In February, Callie drove to the town where her grandmother had lived before she moved to Millhaven, a small place an hour north with a grain elevator and a hardware store and a diner that had been the same diner for 60 years. She went because Frances Beale had found, in the course of her historical research on the case, a reference to a relative of Elara's who had settled there in the 1930s, a younger sister, apparently, who had left Millhaven after the property dispute and built a life elsewhere without knowing what Elara had done before she left. The trail ended there, the relative long dead, no descendants in the directory that Frances had searched. But Callie drove to the town anyway, because she wanted to see where part of the story had gone. She walked the main street in the February cold and looked at the buildings and thought about Elara's sister walking the same street with the knowledge of the fraud behind her and nothing in front of her but the necessity of starting again. She stopped at the diner. She ordered coffee. She sat at the counter and looked out the window at the street, and she thought about all the ways a story branches, all the lines that go out from a central point and travel in directions that do not intersect again. All the people who carry a piece of something and never know they are carrying it. All the sisters and cousins and neighbors who touch the edges of a thing and move on without knowing the shape of the whole. She could not find them all. She understood that. The chain she was part of was one chain, the one that had stayed at the river, the one that had ended with Callie in rubber boots at 5 in the morning with collection jars and a notebook. There were other chains. There were other people in other towns who carried, without knowing it, some thread of Elara's story. She could not reach all of them. She could only be the part of the story that she was the part that had found the box, the part that had stood in the bank conference room and the courthouse and said, "Here is what is true," the part that was still, every morning, standing at the river's edge with her boots in the water and her attention on the thing in front of her. That was enough. That had to be enough. And in the specific, grounded way that she understood things now, not as abstractions, but as the weight of actual days, actual choices, actual mornings on the actual river, she understood that it was. She drove back to Millhaven in the early afternoon, the winter fields flat and pale on either side of the road, the sky the particular white of February that contains neither the gray of storm nor the blue of clear weather, but something in between, something that is simply the color of a world waiting for the season to turn. She drove past the town line and down the main street and left on the road that ran along the river and into her driveway, and she cut the engine and sat for a moment looking at the house. The repaired porch, level now, no longer tilting toward the left. The window in the kitchen with the new frame that would open all year. The chimney with its fresh mortar. The door, which was the same door it had always been, hung in its frame with the same swing it had always had, opening into the same entry with the same floor and the same smell of wood and river air that she had known since she was small. She got out of the car and went inside and put the kettle on and opened the kitchen window 2 inches despite the cold, the way she had done all her life, because she liked to hear the river. The river was there. It was always there, dark and cold and patient and continuous, running past the bare willows toward wherever rivers go, carrying everything it had ever been given and keeping what it held and moving forward with the simple, total commitment of a thing that does not question whether forward is the right direction. She stood at the open window with her coffee and listened to it. The sound it made in winter was different from the sound it made in summer, lower, more deliberate, the current slower under the cold, the water heavy with what it carried. She had been listening to that sound her whole life, and she was still learning the variations in it, still hearing things she had not heard before. She thought she would be listening to it for the rest of her life, and still finding new things in it, new tones and rhythms and qualities of attention it required. She thought that was exactly right. She thought that was the whole point. She took the photograph of Elara down from the wall and held it for a moment, looking at it in the winter light from the open window. The river sound came in around her. The photograph showed the woman standing in front of the house in 1924, straight-backed, clear-eyed, holding herself with the posture of someone who has decided permanently not to be diminished. She looked at the expression on Elara's face, the one that was not quite a smile. She understood it now, fully, in a way she had not understood it even in the courthouse or the bank conference room or on the repaired dock in the October dark. It was not resolve, though it was that. It was not defiance, though it was that too. It was something simpler and more durable than either of those things. It was the expression of a person who is looking at the camera, but is thinking about the person who will look at the photograph, the person who is not yet born, whose face cannot be known, who will come in some future decade and stand where she is standing and hold what she built. It was the expression of someone who is in the middle of a transmission and knows it, and is at peace with the middle, because the middle is the part that belongs to her, and she has done it faithfully. Callie put the photograph back on the wall. She went to the counter and picked up the iron box and carried it to the window and held it in the light from outside. The winter light that made no promises but was honest in its limitations, the light of a season that is simply what it is. She held the box and looked at the river through the open window, and she felt, in the way that you feel something when it has finally settled all the way into the bones of you, the full weight of what she was holding and what had held it before her and what she intended to hold it after. She was the current guardian. She was not the first, and she would not be the last, and the guardianship was not a burden she had chosen so much as a true thing she had recognized, the way you recognize a true thing when you encounter it. Not with surprise, but with the particular stillness of confirmation, the sense of a thing clicking into the place it was always going to occupy. She set the box back on the counter. She closed the window. She finished her coffee. Then she put on her rubber boots and her jacket and picked up her notebook and her collection jars and went out to the river, because it was still morning, and the morning samples were still the first order of the day, and the river was still there and still running and still, in its patient and continuous way, keeping everything it had ever been trusted to keep. She waded in at the first sampling point, the cold coming up through the rubber, the current pushing gently at her legs the way it always had, the way it had pushed at Elara's legs and her mother's legs, and every marsh who had stood in this water going back further than the records could tell. She uncapped the first collection jar and held it below the surface and watched it fill with the clear, cold, river-dark water, full of what the river knew and what it held and what it was not finished carrying. She capped the jar. She wrote the reading in her notebook. She moved to the next point. The river ran on around her, going where it was going, the way it had always gone and would always go. And above it the February sky was the color of something about to change, and the willows along the bank held their bare branches over the water with the patience of things that know the season will turn and are content to wait. And Callie Marsh stood in the current with her boots and her jars and her attention and her inheritance, all of it, the money and the land and the foundation and the scholarship and the photograph and the iron box and the letter written in 1968 and delivered 50 years later, and the word yet in the margin of a court transcript, and the river and the roots and the full, specific, irreplaceable knowledge of what a true thing deserves. And she did the next thing, and the next thing after that, and the river carried her forward the way it carries everything forward, patient and cold and continuous, and keeping what it holds, all the way to where it is going. Spring came to Millhaven the way it always did, not all at once, but in negotiations. A warm day, then 3 cold ones, then 2 warm ones, then a frost that killed the early crocuses and made everyone who had planted too soon feel foolish in the particular way that optimism always feels foolish when the world corrects it. Then, finally, the real warmth, the kind that stays, the kind that the soil absorbs and holds and gives back slowly over the long weeks of April and May until the whole river corridor smelled of green things becoming themselves. Callie noticed, on a Tuesday morning in late April, that something had grown back at the willow bend. It was not the box. The box was on her counter where it belonged. It was not anything she could name at first. A thickening in the root system, a new growth between the 2 largest roots where the iron box had sat for nearly a century, filling the gap that the box's removal had left. She crouched at the water's edge and looked at it carefully, the way she looked at everything the river showed her, not with the expectation of explanation, but with the willingness to simply see what was there. It was a plant, small, new, growing directly from the silt between the roots with the particular determination of something that has decided this is its place. She did not know the species immediately, which was unusual. She knew the river vegetation well enough that unrecognized plants were rare. She photographed it and sent the image to a botanist at the university who worked with the foundation, and he called her back within the hour, his voice carrying the specific excitement of a scientist encountering something genuinely unexpected. It was a species, he told her, that had not been documented in this river corridor in recorded history. It was not invasive. It was, in fact, the opposite, a native species so rare in this region that its presence here suggested the root system had been sheltering its seeds for a very long time, protecting them from the conditions that had caused the species to disappear from the surrounding landscape. The removal of the box, he said, had probably let in just enough light and disturbance to allow germination. Callie crouched at the water's edge for a long time after she hung up, looking at the small green plant between the roots. The box had been protecting something without knowing it, or perhaps knowing it, in whatever way a thing knows what it does. It had sat in the roots and kept its contents and, incidentally, kept something else too, something older than itself, something that had been waiting in the dark of the silt for the conditions to change. She thought that was the most Elara thing she had ever heard of. She did not move the plant. She marked its location in the Foundation's monitoring database and flagged it for regular observation and notified the botanist that he was welcome to come and study it, provided he came on foot and touched nothing without asking. He said he would come on Thursday. She went home and stood at the kitchen counter and looked at the iron box. "You were still doing it," she said to it. "All this time. Still keeping something." The box sat on the counter and said nothing, which was the correct response, and she laughed a real laugh. the kind that comes up from somewhere deep and unhurried, and made coffee and went to her desk and opened her laptop and began the day's work. Outside, the river ran past the willows in the April light, bright and fast with snow melt, carrying the cold of the mountain it had come from and the warmth of the valley it was moving through, holding both at once the way rivers hold everything, the past and the present, and the small green thing growing in the roots, reaching toward the light that had finally, after all this time, been let in. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.